grid is the one everybody knows, sort of like hub and spoke, in a lot of ways limited by transmission capacity across long distances, and across short distances, which is where we would have the most impact, even limitations on distribution lines, right? How much power is required of that distribution line, what non-wires alternatives are available. And so, in terms of like linking this back to the controls and communication piece, we would like to, everybody I think would like to make virtual power plants simpler, right? That's the goal, is to be able to use all of these assets that are distributed all around the country in a coordinated way with known communication protocols and expectations for performance. But that's really what we want, because then we don't have to build a lot of very large new power plants, right? Whether they be fossil fuel or nuclear or whatever, like we don't have to build a lot of power plants because we have a lot of distributed capacity spread around the grid already. How we use that capacity effectively has always been the question, right? Whether it's, how much can we feed back into the grid and what limitations do the existing substations have? Or how do we dispatch from the batteries to either offset site load or export back to the grid to offset the demand, either at just, peak times or because there is literally not enough capacity in the distribution lines. That's really what we want. And that's another reason that we need 1,000 of these operating, because a few does not make a difference to the grid. 1,000 really does. If you can bring on even 1,000 100 kW batteries, that's a really big deal. The blue boxes, aside from the generator, are what we bring when we bring a microgrid to life. So we will add some solar. That's the PV bottom right. That's the ESS. So we'll bring the battery as well. And we'll bring a control system, that's the Stellar Edge, and then some version of load shedding often. And that's what these contactors are intended to show, except for one, and that's the utility contactor at the top of the main distribution panel. So in normal operation, I'll keep this short because I think you know how these work, right? The point of the system is to maximize the economic benefit of the assets that you have. So the job of the Stellar Edge is to keep track of what's happening as far as loads in the building, understand what the rate schedule looks like, and dispatch the battery and or solar as needed to maximize the economic returns. When the power goes out, it gets a lot more interesting, and that's why microgrids are cool. As soon as the power goes out, the utility contactor will open, right? We have components that do that. That's typically not the Stellar Edge. That's typically something else, like an SEL 751 that the utility has experience with and they believe in and everybody is comfortable with. So the utility contactor will open automatically. When the battery recognizes that the utility contactor has successfully opened, it will switch from following the signals from the grid to forming its own grid by controlling voltage and frequency. That transition time, depending on the OEM of the battery itself, can take milliseconds, or it could take 10 to 15 seconds, just depending on what size range you're working in and who the manufacturer is. That transition from grid following to grid forming is also not necessarily controlled by the Stellar Edge. And so the point I'm trying to make here is that when we talk microgrid controls, there are multiple levels of control systems all throughout the system. The battery alone will have the BMS on the battery modules themselves. The inverter will probably have some kind of native EMS associated with it. And the Stellar Edge is really a site controller, right? Coordinating multiple assets across the system and optimizing their performance.
This is a site, the white line, these are all images from the platform. The white line is the load, and the green, the yellow is solar. So this is a typical day. And click a bit. So then click one. So the customer wants to manage this power system with certain controls, and you click. Just look at two particular things. They want to keep the battery at 95% as much as possible, because for resilience, like Nate was talking about, but also they want to mitigate demand charges. So they want to limit the amount of import that they're taking from the grid to 80. And when we talk about trade-offs, this is an important question. Like, well, I want to limit how much I'm taking from the grid, but I'm limited by how much battery I have. We'll talk about that in a second. So, keep these two numbers in mind. They have a target of 80 and a target state of charge of 95. Okay, so click 1. So we can see, obviously their load exceeds 80 at some point. So we need to carve up the top of that load and deal with it. So now let's look at one more, and we'll see how the load is being serviced by a combination of the battery, solar, and grid. So you can see how that, you can see the battery is discharging in the morning and then charging in the afternoon. So click 1 and we'll peel away the battery and the solar, and we see this is just the grid. And you can see how the edge and the New Sun Road system is maintaining the grid consumption below that target of 80 for most of the day. And okay, so let's go 1, and we can look at, go one more, and we can see what does this look like at different times of the day. So let's say click 1 in the morning. We can see here's the moment where it's discharging. If you look at that flow diagram, you can see that there's power flowing out of the battery on the bottom left, and the battery's already down at 50. That green line on the chart below the one we had been looking at before is the battery SOC. So you see that the battery's been discharging, the state of charge goes down, and then later in the afternoon, you can click 1. So about 1:30, the load is low enough that the controller is saying, okay, now I can start recharging the battery, still maintaining the grid below that 80 target, but now using the grid to recharge the battery, getting it back up. You can click 1 to 95, and you can see so you can see on the green line, but also in the bottom left-hand block of the diagram that says the battery is now at 95, so it's not consuming from the grid anymore. It's just allowing the grid to meet the load. So that's just an example of a day of controls.